Hello and welcome everyone to our today's webinar, Introduction to the IT4IT Reference Architecture. This webinar contains a short introduction of BIS design and CC&C, and then the main part will be held from CC&C Introduction to IT4IT. Afterwards, I will show you how you can work with reference architectures in our tool BIS Design Enterprise Studio. And at the end of our webinar, we will have a Q&A session where we can respond to all your questions that occur during this webinar. My name is Bernd Ihnen and I'm living in Hamburg, Germany. I'm consultant and trainer at BIS Design. My main focus is at the enterprise architecture discipline. Other areas of work and interest contain application management, ERP systems, or modeling languages. BIS Design is a Dutch company founded in 2000 as a spin-off from a R&D institute. We are a global, fast-growing company with direct presence in more than 10 countries, having more than 1,000 customers on 6 continents across all industries. We have very passionate people that share a lot of information. You really should take a look at the blog at our website. You will find a lot of helpful information. Recently, we were assessed as one of the leaders in Gartner's Magic Quadrant for EA, and in a former assessment, we received the most highest ratings for different EA capabilities a tool can offer. With this being said, I would like to close our introduction and hand over to Dan Warfield from CC&C.
Hello, Bernd. Are you seeing my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. Hello and welcome. I think we're all technically okay now. I'm not quite sure how to get rid of this little annoying thing there. So, thank you for coming today. My name is Dan Warfield. I'm a senior enterprise architect with CC&C Solutions, which is an enterprise architecture consultancy and training company that is based in Sydney, has offices in North America, and we are opening our European operations this year. I'm glad that you're able to attend. I'm glad that you're interested in IT4IT. I have been working in this space for about 2 years now and have applied IT4IT in a very large company at 2 different levels of abstraction. One was to develop an operating model for the enterprise IT division, and the other one was more pragmatic and prosaic, which was to develop a framework for understanding how to focus investment in products and rationalize products. So I'm going to talk today about what IT4IT is. This is the first of 3 webinars, and this is the introductory session. We're not going to go into a lot of depth. However, please note your questions. We'll take questions at the end. I'll talk a little bit first about the Open Group. I'm assuming that a lot of you are familiar with the Open Group, but in case you're not, the Open Group is a global consortium of IT vendors, IT consumers, consultants, and other people, scientists, academics who are interested in IT. The most famous property of the Open Group is probably Unix. The Open Group also owns the TOGAF standard, which is the Open Group architecture framework, which is used by thousands of people worldwide. CC&C's business includes training people in TOGAF and now in IT4IT, and we have trained a substantial portion of the currently practicing TOGAF certified architects. The Open Group is global and has a large membership around the world, as you can see. The need for something like IT4IT is something that was recognized a few years by the Open Group It is a standard reference architecture and operating model for managing the business of IT. In my own case, working in a large company, we set out to define an operating model for our global IT division, and very quickly realized there wasn't anything to go and get. So there wasn't some industry standard, some best practice on how to understand an enterprise IT operation from a global view, which surprised me. And the same absence of anything to go use as a starting point for this sort of work is what got the IT4IT standard going in the first place. The main perspective of the, I'm just going to back up, sorry about that. The main business perspective is the IT value chain, which I'll come back to in a minute, and it is based on commonly used business ways of understanding operations across other parts of business. One of the values of IT4IT is that when you're using this model to communicate what's going on in your IT division to other parts of the business, they will recognize the languages and the structures that you're using. The IT4IT forum, of which CC&C are a member, started in September of 2011, and has released a number of versions of the architecture over the last 5 years now, almost 5 years. The original group was based around Shell in Holland, and some of the original members that were deeply involved in that were HP, Accenture, and of course Shell itself, and they're still active in the forum. Others have joined over the years. Different, and I didn't have a good answer. I started working with the forum, and the best thing that I was told about it was it isn't anybody's property. It doesn't belong to someone who's trying to sell you some software or someone who's trying to sell you some hardware or some consulting. It is a genuinely vendor agnostic piece of work, and most of the other things we looked at, like COBIT, which belongs to ISACA, ITIL, which belongs to a combination private-public consortium in the UK, and other models actually belong to a certain group and have an agenda of some kind that is more focused on that agenda than it is on the whole spectrum of operating IT. A question that we get asked a lot is, why do we need this when we have ITIL? And so we have a slide in here to just discuss that a little bit. First of all, ITIL is a descriptive framework that is primarily functional and talks about really IT service management and really infrastructure. IT4IT is more broad than that, and if you're an ITIL fanatic, you might say, well, ITIL describes everything you do in IT, but actually, if you go into a big IT shop and say, well, where are the ITIL people? They're in infrastructure, because that's where the ITIL is strong and that's where its depth is. You won't find a lot of development people referring to ITIL to describe what their processes look like. IT4IT spans everything from concept to service delivery. IT4IT is in some ways more specific than ITIL in that it is focused on enterprise architects and management rather than the broader set of viewpoints that ITIL is trying to serve. So in some ways this specificity helps us to be more useful for the architecture work that we're trying to do. Also, and this surprises a lot of people who have gone on an ITIL course and had a certification, and the course seems very structured and prescriptive. If you actually look at the ITIL documentation, you'll find that it is primarily narrative. It tells a story about how things should work. It is not prescriptive. It is very flexible and gives you lots of opportunities and options to do things in a different way. IT4IT is more prescriptive. It is based on an architecture viewpoint rather than an operations viewpoint, and tries to be more precise. From the core IT4IT documentation, you can get information about what to do and how to do it, and not just a more flexible description that leaves you in some ways too open to doing things in a unique way. The value proposition in ITIL is really focused at a lower level of detail, and is about function and process. It's very useful to people in service desks and change management and functions like that that are described in depth by ITIL. IT4IT has a value proposition that spans the whole enterprise IT operation. I'm not going to read all of this to you because I'm conscious of the time. ITIL does have a very strong waterfall approach. Agile ITIL is difficult. IT4IT is not as dependent on any specific methodology, and Agile shops and DevOps focused shops can use IT4IT in a very productive way. So let's talk about where this came from. The top level concept in IT4IT is this, very familiar if you're a business executive or manager. If you have a business focused education, this is a very familiar model. It is the Porter value chain, and it goes back decades, and this is widely used throughout the world as a way of describing how we operate our business. You will find this basic flow of primary functional areas and sitting on top of a set of supporting operations as how do you deliver value in your business. IT4IT is exactly about applying this model and this way of thinking to the business of IT. The open group version of that, as it applies to the business of IT, looks like this. It is an application of Porter's thinking. There are four primary value streams in the value chain model, which are strategy to portfolio, requirement to deploy, request to fulfill, and detect to correct, or when you're talking to people who aren't used to that sort of language, plan, build, deliver, and run as four well-defined areas of work. The underlying supporting activities are described to the extent that they are directly relevant to these four main value streams, but in the IT4IT reference you'll find that a lot of things about those supporting activities are not mentioned because they aren't directly connected to the main flow of value building. Let's talk a little bit about what each of these value streams is about. The first one, strategy to portfolio, is about planning. It is about demand management. It is about enterprise architecture. It's about taking in the demand from the business, rationalizing it into a set of things that IT will deliver. In the IT4IT model, we talk about the conceptual service blueprint, which is the architectural description of something that IT is going to deliver. And it's very important, if you want to understand IT4IT, to know that everything that IT delivers is a service in the IT4IT lexicon. So everything that we're talking about throughout the IT value chain has to do with services we are delivering. This is language that a lot of people find difficult. A lot of architects, a lot of enterprise IT shops have rejected service because it has too many meanings, and they talk about products rather than services. They say, well, our IT shop has products that we deliver, which might be a ERP product, or it might be a desktop support product, and these kinds of things. In the IT4IT language, we're going back to a more pure systems-oriented view, and we're saying these are all services, and everything we do is a service. In strategy to portfolio, we create the conceptual service blueprints that describe at an architectural level what each service does. Requirement to deploy takes those conceptual service blueprints and builds logical service models that actually describe in detail how this will work. And this is the work that the development team traditionally does. They build something that can be deployed. That's the logical model. And they create service releases, which can be handed to deployment people and to put into production. The request to fulfill takes the logical service blueprint, which has been developed, tested, the release packages have been created, and request to fulfill describes the processes, a standard set of ways of working in which you can put things into production in a repeatable way based on reusable services and interface with all of the consumers of those services. Detect is management, remediation, its infrastructure and the service model is the main component of the IT4IT conceptual world. The service model goes through a life cycle, and it's pictured in this model as running from conceptual to logical to realized, and it's a continuous loop, as are a lot of models, as is TOGAF, as is ITIL. In some ways, we always are trying to improve and develop. The logical service the conceptual service is described by architects. The conceptual service blueprint is the thing that you build projects to deliver. The logical service blueprint is what you design and build. The service release is available for production and goes into a service catalog, which then gets put into production and becomes actual configuration items, or CIs, as we say in infrastructure. And this is a continuous loop that's based primarily on these three objects that are at the core of IT4IT, the conceptual, logical, and realized service model. There is no set of software you can buy today that allows you to record things in this way. The realization of this vision of how to manage IT end-to-end is limited today by the lack of a common semantics across these different areas. In my own work in enterprise IT, the most important problem that I've encountered that's addressed by IT4IT is loss of information as you go through the value chain. When someone asks you to produce some software or to make some changes to a system, we record who asked us, what they wanted, what their requirements were, what value they expect to get, who's the owner of the system that will go into production. We have all that information. By the time that it's in production, it's very common in most big IT organizations that the service desk and the CMDB and all of that end of the world has a whole lot of things in production, most of which they don't know very much about. All the information that we created about why we did this has disappeared somewhere. All the information created in development about how it was built and who built it and what the design decisions were that were taken and what the trade-offs were that were thought about vanished. Often even the source code has vanished. The ideas that the developers and the software distribution people had about how to deploy it and what a release package looks like often vanished. In a fully mature IT4IT environment, all of this information is captured. There is no such environment today. When we get there, I believe that enterprise IT will be completely transformed, much more productive, and it's something that has to happen if we want to really realize this dream that everyone's talking about now about automation and DevOps and everything happening sort of untouched by human hands. It's not very easy to do that if you don't have a common language and a common conceptual model like this that describes everything you do and hooks it together. The concept in IT4IT is always to talk about the service model, and each of the 4 value streams does things to the service model to transform it. It's a bit like the life cycle of a tadpole to a frog. The tadpole doesn't look like the frog, but it's the same thing. Similarly here. This chart describes what each of the 4 areas does fundamentally. Strategy to portfolio is mainly about creating the desired service catalog and funding things that we think are important. If you have a service portfolio that's well defined, this is really very architecture based. We are saying what capabilities do we need to change, how do those affect our service portfolio, what things do we need to put in production, what shall we invest in, how shall we prioritize it. The requirement to deploy is all about building things and getting them ready to deploy. Request to fulfill, as I said before, is about publish and subscribe. When I showed this model to one of my colleagues in a large company, he started looking in detail at request to fulfill. He said, that doesn't look very familiar to me. That looks a lot like cloud. And the answer was, absolutely that looks like cloud, because that's where we're going. The standard service delivery model for enterprise IT is very, very quickly around the world becoming a cloud-looking thing. Not everything will go into the cloud, but the expectations of the whole conversation between enterprise IT, IT vendors, consumers of IT services is about a metaphor and a model for how services are delivered and consumed that is addressed directly by IT4IT, and that is often completely ignored by traditional IT, in which people build something, chuck it over the wall, and when you ask them, well, who's using this and why and what's a good experience for them, they don't know. How will you charge for it? That's not part of the spec, and so on. This picks up all of that material, integrates it into an end-to-end view. Detect to correct, excuse me, detect to correct is about the things we do once things are in production, and as you know, if you work in enterprise IT, a whole lot of that is about fixing things that are broken and resolving problems that people have and answering questions that people have. So there is, thus detect to correct, there is an emphasis on that. The part that I like best, as you may guess from me talking about semantics and data, is the information model. The information model in IT4IT is not complete. There's a lot of work still being done on it. It's still very high level. However, there is a set of data objects and relationships that is defined that runs from one end of the value chain to the other. And the key thing for successful implementation of this way of thinking about IT4IT will be to start putting that into production in tools, in companies, and in the way that we help people model success. Each of the data objects describes some aspect of a service. Each of them can be looked at as input or output information for a functional component or a life cycle phase. And there is a structure to them. In the IT4IT model, there are these data object types, what are called key data objects, which are black in the picture, if you've got the picture, and I'll show that to you in a minute. These are important, and the reason they're key data objects is because if you can get all of these things managed consistently across your value chain, you've gone a long way toward being able to get control of your IT enterprise operation. The purple ones are data objects that are instances of the life cycle of the service model, and these are what I referred to before as conceptual, logical, and realized service model. These are the key things at the core of the data model. Everything that we do in an IT4IT centric view is we operate against the service model in its various forms as it evolves through the life cycles. Auxiliary data objects are in the model to help make it complete, but they are not part of the main value stream, just as the supporting activities in the value chain model are not fully described in IT4IT. Auxiliary data objects are not as robustly identified here. In practice, depending on what you're doing with IT4IT, you may find that you need to build out on this model in ways that support the needs of your organization, and I've had to do that. And it's important to remember that this is a reference architecture, which is the thing that you start with to create a solution architecture. And in the process of doing that, things in the reference architecture may change, but some of the parts of it, like the baseline data model, need to stay the same for you to be able to do consistent, repeatable work. This is the level 1 architecture picture. It describes a set of functional components, which are the blue boxes. It describes the information model as dots and lines, if you like. And this is an excellent picture in my experience, because when you show this to a non-architect manager, when you show this to someone in IT who is more interested in operating the IT in the IT division or their piece of it or their department than they are in architectural concepts and lots of big picture rigor, they can find themselves in this picture. You can talk them through it, you can show them where they fit, they can see that, they understand it. Say, yes, oh, I do that. And all of the activities in the main value chain for an IT operation are described here. The black circles are the key data objects in the IT4IT model. The purple circles represent the core transformational phases of the service model as it goes from a conceptual service to actual CIs in the CMDB in production. The shopping cart that you see at top center is one of those auxiliary data objects that we expect you will need, but it's not a key object in the model. Integration between components is described to some extent in the model, and this is where the importance of the semantic consistency really comes into play. Most big enterprise IT organizations suffer from lots and lots of systems with lots and lots of point-to-point integration. There are all kinds of workarounds for that, but what typically happens is a big mess, and part of what IT4IT is helpful for is in attacking that mess by taking a view of the systems that we're using and the data that we're using to manage IT that looks partly like this. One of the key concepts is that you need to have a system of record for your key data. So not only do you need to have events and incidences in this model, you need to have one place that's the system of record, that's the single source of truth about that, and that's very, very important for moving from the conceptual view that we're talking about here to actual bottom line improvements. That is what people actually are expecting you to do. We have systems of engagement integrations, which are described by the dotted line. We also have systems of insight integrations. One of the most exciting things about IT4IT that we're just starting to talk about, which is represented by IT Data Warehouse, is that when we get a consistent language for describing the work that we do in IT, we can start to apply some of the big data and analytics capabilities that are being used in other areas to our own work and start to learn things about what we're doing that we were not going to find out doing things the way we have been doing them. There's a lot in the model that describes how integration should work. The data model in IT4IT is not complete. As I said, it's being worked on this year. There will be, one of the current discussions is, can we provide certification to vendors for IT4IT compliance? I can say this piece of software is IT4IT compliant. To be IT4IT compliant, you probably need to conform to the data specification about inputs and outputs from the functional areas that your software is responsible for. Right now we don't have that in enough detail to certify a piece of software. That's being worked on. So right now these different levels of abstraction are done at different levels of completion. Level 1 you just saw, level 2 is pretty good, level 3 is being worked on. Level 1 is the overview level, and it describes the value streams, the components, the data objects, the service model backbone, which are the purple circles, and the basic relationships. The level 1 picture does not show cardinality. However, cardinality is in the model. As you see, drill in a little bit, you can find it there. The functional component is the smallest unit of technology that can stand on its own. This is some of the technical description from the spec. There are quite a lot of other components, management systems, and functional things that happen in IT that are not considered important from the IT4IT perspective. They drift in and out of the diagrams as auxiliary data objects. Primary functional component, just as a primary data component, is necessary if you're going to have an IT4IT discussion, if you're going to do an IT4IT compliant tool or model. The secondary functional components are much less well described in IT4IT, and in practice you will find, if you're using this to understand your work in a particular environment, you will bring secondary functional components in very strongly in some cases. In other cases you may ignore them. A good example of that, for example, is all the things around finance, the things around security and compliance, things around governance. Depending on what you're trying to do, these may be very important to creating a complete solution architecture for the IT operational problem you're trying to address, or maybe not. These are not strongly addressed in the primary model, but it's important to know that these other things are there, can be there, and you can beef them up if you need to. This is a view of the level 1 model with only the data objects showing, and again, people say, well, that's not architecture, it's too simple, you know, where's the cardinality, what's going, this is just some circles and lines, and it looks like a PowerPoint, and it is, and that's part of the strength of it, is I can show this to the Senior Vice President of Infrastructure, and she will find herself there in that picture. She will understand it. Models that we looked at in work I've done, like COBIT, which is much more dense and complex and also designed primarily for auditors. You show that to the average IT management people, they will go to sleep, most of them. It's just too complicated. This is pretty straightforward. Level 1, as I said, does not include cardinality. It does include names, functional components, lifecycle data objects, the relationships, and the service model backbone. This is a very powerful picture. Level 2, we see cardinality. In level 2, there's some definition of a minimal amount of attributes for each of the data objects, but not very much, to be fair. This is an illustrative example of one way of viewing system of record integration. It is not complete. It is meant to be instructional rather than architectural. If you look at the big box, event management and incident management, this is examples picked partly because these are familiar to a lot of people as things they already know something about. Part of what IT4IT is doing is describing in a prescriptive way how those two functional areas need to communicate. And if you look at this picture, and I assume these slides will be available later, what this is really meant to convey is, here's an area that you probably know about if you're an IT person or an infrastructure service management person. You know about events and incidents. How does IT4IT describe what we pretty much already do, and how do you map that back to other things that you're familiar with? The system of record is a very important concept here, because even if we're pretty good at service management, even if you have an ITSM service management suite mainly from a single vendor, you may not really have very good systems of record for one source of the truth about certain kinds of data. In a large organization, it's really not unusual at all for people to have lots of vendors, and this gets very messy. I'm not going to go through all the slides because I'm conscious I need to hand back over to Bernd in a minute. But this goes into the same subject matter a little bit deeper. I encourage you to get these and study them a bit more at your leisure. I'll just dwell for a couple of minutes on the level 2 diagrams. Level 2 diagrams are also very useful and also help people understand what we're doing in a number of ways. First of all, you can see the gray boxes represent the auxiliary components, and these are things that happen in your world, but they're not, strictly speaking, part of the core model, but it does show how they connect. The cardinalities are there, some of the data flows are there with arrows. This is a very, very useful set of diagrams for talking through with people the real importance of taking a systems view of what we do. So the root cause of your consistent data problem in the CMDB may very well be, as it was in one case I worked on, poor onboarding of contractors in development. And think about why that might be true. That was what one company found. That was the top thing in the entire organization that they realized they needed to fix to get service management outcomes to improve quickly. I again won't dwell on each of these. It's worth taking a look at them. Thinking about these relationships, this is my favorite one because it's the thing that most people don't do. They don't have service catalogs except for things like, I would like a server. They don't have service catalogs about everything that we deliver to customers, which is what this is about, and putting release packages together that talk about, here's the usage measurement approach that we're taking, here's the charging approach that we're taking, here's how we will subscribe and unsubscribe people, here's how we will spin things up and spin things down, here's what sorts of systems they'll be deployed to. Release packages tend not to include any of that. That's sort of left up to people to figure out. That's one place where information disappears. That's all I'm really going to talk about today. It's very high level, very quick helicopter view of what IT4IT is. If you take the time to look at the spec and standard, I think it's available free to anybody as an HTML, through an HTML viewer from the open group. You can look at it in quite a lot of detail. I would encourage anyone on here who's trying to understand this to do that. Dig into it a little bit, try to understand, look at the definitions of each of these gray boxes, blue boxes, black dots, purple dots, and try to understand the flow of value through the IT organization from the point of view of everything that we're doing is about evolving a set of services that are collectively our service portfolio and what we are doing for a living in enterprise IT. So that's all I've got, and I'll hand it back over to Bernd if he would like to go ahead and seize the screen.
All right. Sharing my screen. Dan, am I already back on?
I see you.
Okay, great. Then I will take over. Thank you very much. So, yeah, that was a very interesting introduction to the IT4IT framework. And as you might have spotted, or maybe it's already known, many parts are modeled in the Archimate modeling language. And Archimate is one of the modeling language BizDesign Enterprise Studio supports. So what I've prepared here are just some slides and some presentation overviews about how you can model the IT4IT reference model in the BizDesign Enterprise Studio. You can create an overview for all the slides or all the diagrams you create and want to share for a specific stakeholder. And I will go to the functional component overview. So when we take a look at this overview, you recognize that this is really the same picture you've seen moments ago at the presentation of Dan. So what we can do is we have several objects like the application components and the data objects represented here. We can change the graphic shapes so you can make it presentable to other stakeholders, non-IT stakeholders, if you would like to, but this is more than simple Visio drawings or PowerPoint drawings, because behind all of these boxes there's an architectural element behind. So everything is stored in one or more models, and you can organize them in folders. So I've created one folder for the IT and for IT models. Included here the IT4IT reference model, put some structure in there, and somewhere down below where it makes sense, I will find the specific component. And if I don't want to look for it, I can just simply right-click here and locate the object. So what you really see here, it is not just Visio, it is really a model package standing behind, and you can create relations and you can analyze them, and on top of that you can add attributes to all of the elements within the repository. So you can add attributes like a system owner or whatever might be interesting for you to have in your architecture, which kind of information. You can add it to the applications. You can add information to data objects. You can also add information and documentation to the diagrams you see, to the folders. So everything can be documented to have one single source of information. When we go to the next picture, as I've said, we can create diagrams and matrices, and we can also go deeper into detail of this model. Like the slides we've seen, there's a strategy to portfolio part which is described in more detail, and this is something what you can also, of course, model in Enterprise Studio, and here are more relations available. So this is a more detailed view on this architecture part of IT4IT. And without going into details in this part, I would like to show you a functionality, because when you take a look at the functional components landscape, you might want to start assigning applications to different logical components or functional components of this reference architecture to know, okay, which parts of this reference model I've already realized, which part is supported already by my IT, or what is already gathered and put into the model. So to keep track on the solutions you use for realizing the IT4IT or any other reference model, you can create a solutions model like I've just done and create a realizations view. So this is just a simple diagram, and let's take just a few components out of the reference model, like the enterprise architecture component, the portfolio demand component or the service portfolio component, and I just copy and paste it into this new view, into our new model, and I just delete everything I do not need. But I do not delete it from the model, but only from this view. And I can also make it a more architectural view by just resetting the graphics. And now we're more in the architectural world with our graphic notation. And I will select our tool, for example, the Business Design Enterprise Studio. And yes, there's also a second tool from our other partner, Cast Highlight. And I can now relate this solution to different parts of the reference architecture. And I can state which application realizes a specific part of the IT4IT framework. So let's do it for these three components. And we are using this smart connector, which is very easy to use. And by creating these relations, we already connect the solutions model with the reference model. And this is also something you can use when you want to do some analysis or some highlights when you go back to your stakeholder and state that you're working on this reference model. And you can also show graphically which parts of the reference model is already supported by different applications. And this is just an example. So this does not mean that this is limited in everything we support or Cast Highlight supports, but this should sell the impression and the functionality, what you can do with our tool. You can directly apply what you do with this reference model. So you can see that the Best Design Enterprise Studio supports the green marked components, and the Cast Highlight application supports other components, and there's some overlap. And basically, we have a partnership and a common product with Cast, so this is not unusual for us to have. And you can also spot other parts of the reference model which are either not yet supported or the model is not filled like that for the moment. So this is what you can do to connect the reference model to your architecture. And I would also like to state that this is not the only reference model we support. As you've heard that IT4IT really complies with the ITIL framework, we can also support the ITIL reference model. And in this case, I have created a check because for this ITIL project, in this part, I do not relate directly the applications or other parts of the architecture to the reference model. I've just adapted parts of the ITIL reference model. As you can see, I've adapted the service operation and just included parts of the processes and put parts of the processes together. And again, I can heat map which parts of the reference model are already supported by the implemented processes, which were put together. And the other way around, I can do the same based on the relations in the model package in the repository. So you can see an overlap and which processes supports what. So this is a graphical way which is very suited for presenting information to different stakeholders. But of course, you can also represent this kind of information in a matrix. And if we expand to the non-empty rows and columns, just was the wrong button I've hit. So That was the right button I was looking for. So what you can see, this is really something where it gives a lot of power. You can model your architecture, your reference model, your adapted reference model, and you can present it in different ways, in different graphic styles, in a matrix, and also in tables. So this is everything you need to deliver the different TOGAF artifacts of diagrams, catalogs, and matrices. So this is what BizDesign Enterprise Studio can support and can help you with in the presentation and in the work of reference models. So taking a reference model as a basic start, adapted, related to your architecture, these are common things we and our customers do. So let's close this presentation part for now. So that was the part of the BizDesign Enterprise Studio, what we can support. More will be shown in the upcoming webinars we will give. So let us start with the question and answer round. And I will just unmute Dan so he can step in back. Dan, are you here?
I'm here.
All right. We've collected some questions over the webinar. One of the question was related to ITIL. Is it either IT4IT or ITIL? Can it work together? I've seen some parts of it during the presentation. Maybe you want to highlight some key components on this.
So ITIL and IT4IT are complementary. They address different levels of abstraction. They are designed for different purposes, and it's not one thing or the other, and it's certainly not IT4IT is a replacement for ITIL or an improvement on it. It is a different kind of thing. ITIL, in fact, part of the work that I've done using IT4IT, which is actually quite important, is to map the IT4IT model back to the ITIL model, also back to COBIT, I think is quite important, so that you can, and you will find if you do that, and we have done that, that there's quite a lot in IT4IT that ITIL is silent about. There's quite a lot in ITIL that in the specific areas that it's concerned with goes deeper than IT4IT. But ITIL is really meant to help people organize their ITSM operation in the most effective way, and it's very operationally focused. IT4IT is more architecturally focused. So ITIL answers the question of what's the best way to think about change management. IT4IT helps you answer the question, how does the change management process and its data and the tools that we're using to do that fit in with the larger picture in IT, and where are there points of friction, where are there gaps, where are there overlaps, and where is there sort of cognitive dissonance in the way that we describe things from a data point of view that we can fix.
Okay, good, great. There are more questions. Let's continue with two more questions. One is, how does IT4IT help organizations that already have implemented IT service management or are currently doing this?
Well, it's sort of the same answer, which is IT service management is operationally focused. It's you can have a very good ITSM implementation and not have a very good way of managing demand flow from your business and transforming that into a comprehensive service portfolio that does not. ITSM is primarily about the services that are provided by infrastructure. I know there are purists who say, no, it's about everything. Well, actually, in the real world, no, it isn't really. It's primarily about infrastructure. And one place where IT4IT comes into play where a mature ITSM operation is going to struggle is dealing with cloud providers. So if you have a variety of cloud something as a service people providing services to you, I can go to Azure and I can pretend that I'm just going to let Microsoft worry about outages, and I don't need to be able to explain why something's broken because Microsoft's doing it. That doesn't work. What's the language that we're going to use to communicate between our own service operations and the infrastructure and operations people and these different external service providers? We need a common language for that. Being a mature ITIL shop, mature ITSM shop, being or using the semantics created for one vendor for its own purposes isn't going to get the job done. We need a bigger view.
Okay, thank you. And last question. Where do you start to transfer to or transform to IT4IT reference model, and what are the key challenges in the implementation?
Like any other transformation program, if that's what you're doing, you're talking about several years. And like any other transformation program, you start with current pain points and things that are, for whatever reason, seem to be on fire, which could be costs are too high, service quality is too low, it could be don't know what to do about cloud, it could be we've just merged with another company and we don't understand our processes. And in my own experience, a lot of the issue has been that there are silos in big IT organizations that don't talk to each other very much, don't use the same language, and we keep trying to fix things in silo A that are the result of not getting the right inputs from silo B. So what you would do is you work with the management and the IT organization to say, what are the things that are you really think are broken right now? Let's overlay this model onto that, onto how you're working today, and see if we can use it to identify places to start making improvements.
Okay, good. We have 1 minute left. Let's see. I've just read a very interesting question because it relates to other frameworks. What was the driving factor need to create this reference model when there were already other enterprise frameworks such as TOGAF available? And for which verticals industry do you think do require this?
I don't think that IT4IT and TOGAF are the same kind of thing. TOGAF describes a way of doing architecture work. IT4IT describes how you do things from a business point of view in a large IT organization. TOGAF is a piece of that. Enterprise architecture is one of the functional components in IT4IT. So from a business management of IT perspective, certainly you would expect the enterprise architecture function to, hopefully, if you're TOGAF oriented, to use TOGAF as a way of describing how we are going to make the changes that we're talking about. But IT4IT doesn't tell you how to do architecture, and TOGAF doesn't describe the functional operational structure of a business organization the way that IT4IT does.
So the purpose is different. One is for the enterprise architecture and the IT4IT is for the IT operation model.
Well, IT4IT is for the CIO and TOGAF is for the chief architect, maybe a way of looking at it. And the architects can use IT4IT, and in my own experience, doing architecture work using IT4IT, it was very powerful in describing, partly in describing some sort of long-standing EA concepts to the business management that they hadn't been able to understand before.
Okay. All right. So thank you very much. I think we're a little bit over time, but it was very interesting, and we should close the webinar for today with save the dates slide, because there will be 2 more webinars from CC&C and BizDesign about IT4IT and why it is good for architects, and another Enterprise Studio demo about this part at the September 13th, and at October 11th there will be a third webinar about the 7 reasons why IT4IT is good for CIOs, and I will show you something about Enterprise Studio and our portfolio management. So thank you very much for attending, and have a nice day.
Thank you all.